Sometimes when you lie to me, sometimes I lie to you. And there's nothing they could possibly do.
My point was, and continues to be, how long do we have to stay in Bosnia? How long do we have to stay in South Korea? How long are we going to stay in Japan? How long are we going to stay in Germany? All of those 50, 60-year period. No one complains. In fact, they contribute enormously, their presence, to stability in the world. The point is, it's American casualties. We got to get Americans off the front line, have the Iraqis, as part of this strategy, take over more and more of the responsibilities. And then I don't think Americans are concerned if we're there for 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years. What they care about.
We continue to be concerned about Iranian taking al-Qaeda into Iran, training them and sending them back. If we pull out of Iraq, then obviously the Iranian influence is dramatically increased. Al-Qaeda has greater influence and endangers the region dramatically. It's common knowledge and has been reported in the media that that Al-Qaeda is going back into Iran and receiving training and are coming back into Iraq from Iran. That's well known. If we leave Iraq, it will enhance Iranian influence in the region to the detriment, I think, of every nation in the region.
You said that the Iranians were training al-Qaeda.
I'm sorry, the Iranians are training extremists, not al-Qaeda.
Does anybody get the idea that maybe John McCain has no idea what he's talking about? Occupy Iraq for 10,000 years. Confusing al-Qaeda in Iraq with the government of Iraq, those factions backed by Iran. Is this man fit to be the president of the United States? Well, Fred Kaplan wrote a great article for Slate. He's the author of Daydream Believers, about the war party's crazed mindset, and their newest frontman, John McCain, I'm sure plays a part in that, but he's the focus of this new article. How much does John McCain really know about foreign policy? Welcome to the show, Fred.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Oh, I'm glad to have you here, and I'm glad that you're asking this question. It seems like everybody in the media just accepts that John McCain was tortured. He's a war hero. He's an expert. He's experienced, and he's beyond reproach when it comes to foreign policy. There's certainly apparently no reporters anywhere in D.C. who know more about it than him, and so they always defer to his expertise, overlook any flaw, and this is, I dare say, almost heroic that you would even ask the question of whether John McCain is really the foreign policy genius that he's proclaimed to be.
Well, it occurred to me, Obama was over in Europe and the Middle East, and the big question in all the headlines, I remember there was a headline after his first day in Iraq, that the big headline was that he hadn't made any gaffes yet. Everybody was waiting for him to step on some rhetorical landmine, basically. The inexperienced junior senator from Illinois, he's going to screw this up, big risk. And while he was over there, McCain was making comments that if Obama had made them would have been just killing. For example, referring to the Iraq-Pakistan border, which, doesn't exist. Iran is between Iraq and Pakistan.
Actually, I have that clip.
If Obama had said that while he was over in Iraq or Afghanistan, everybody would have quite rightly been all over the guy, like, oh, this proves that he's really not fit for this.
Let me play this clip, Fred, for the audience here, for the people who didn't hear it. It's real short here.
We have a lot of work to do, and I'm afraid that it's a very hard struggle, particularly given the situation on the Iraq-Pakistan border.
All right, now, I got to tell you, I sort of want to let him slide a little bit because I do a lot of talking all day, every day here on this radio show, and there are times where I know I heard a recording once where I referred to the end of the Second World War in 1845.
No, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. But what I'm saying is, I'm confirming your point, that if Obama had said that, that would be taken as indication this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. McCain says it. The implicit presumption is that, well, he's an expert. He was obviously just committing a gaffe. But,
right.
One gaffe after another, confusing Sunnis with Shiites, thinking that Iran is training al-Qaeda. Once they start to pile up, my point is that the basic assumption ought to start to be questioned, namely,
Right.
is this guy really, does he know what's going on in the post-Cold War world? And I moved beyond that and said, well, let's look at some of the things that he's actually proposing, substantive things in prepared speeches. And they just don't make any sense for the world as it is. For example, he talks about kicking Russia out of the G8, the League of Industrial Nations, because they don't share our democratic values. I mean, it would be nice maybe, except for two things. One, nobody else in the G8 is in favor of doing this. Two, the kinds of issues that the G8 is dealing with now, global warming, climate change, terrorism, non-proliferation, common energy policy, these kinds of things really can't be done sensibly without Russian participation. He talks about forming a League of Democracy to take joint action when the UN fails to do so, ignoring a few things. First of all, the democratic nations are sometimes at odds with one another on what kind of action to take. For example, France and Germany did not go along with us on intervening in Iraq. Number two, most of the issues that are now pressing on us you can't really divide them into democratic, non-democratic. The issues which I just mentioned sort of transcend those considerations. And number three, by creating this kind of block of democratic nations and excluding those that aren't, he's just sort of stirring a recipe for a new sort of Cold War, a new way to divide the world, when in fact we should be coming up with ways to find common interests among nations with which we might have problems on some issues. We're no longer in a bipolar world where there's the East and the West, one side, the other side. The United States, furthermore, doesn't have the kind of power, doesn't have the kind of leverage that it did in that kind of world. We should be seeking ways to find lots of coalitions with countries that share our interests on some issues, even if they don't on others. We should be finding ways to unite our friends and divide our enemies, and what McCain is proposing will do the exact opposite. It will be dividing potential allies and uniting our enemies. So that's my basic beef about John McCain.
I wonder about all this stuff about democracy. I mean, I thought it was pretty well established that other than perhaps a couple of true believers, some say Paul Wolfowitz or something like that, but for the most part, isn't it pretty clear that the neoconservatives don't really mean a thing about democracy? They just want regime change. They're imperialists, and democracy is the window dressing they sell us. Does he really believe that the world ought to be divided this way? Is this just an excuse for more conflict?
I don't know what he believes, quite honestly. I mean, the thing about McCain is, there have been times when some of his advisors have been, raving neocons. There are other times when they've been sort of old guard, classic realists. You would think that after the debacle of Iraq, looking at one of Bush's only successes in foreign policy has been when he's completely violated all of his neocon principles, namely the negotiation in North Korea.
Right.
You would think that maybe McCain would be reaching out to some of his old friends like Colin Powell or Brent Scowcroft, people like that. He's not at all. In fact, he's leaning more and more in the opposite direction, which really makes no sense. I think you're right, that quite often the rhetoric of democracy has been window dressing for a sort of neo-colonialism. And, the shame of it, and I'm not being at all sarcastic about this, the shame of it is that on the issues that really concern our security directly, we need to reach out to countries that aren't democratic. And while it would certainly be a good idea to create incentives that lean them in a more democratic direction, there's nothing that we can do to push them in that way. We tried that. It just didn't work. And so one thing that I like about Obama, whose views on foreign policy I don't find perfect, but still one thing I like about him is that he starts from the position that you accept the world as it is. you then want to change it in certain ways, but you start with it as it is. You don't start with it as some kind of fantasy of what you would like it to be. And I find it very interesting that he comes at this not from, say, reading Hans Morgenthau or something, but from reading Saul Alinsky as a community organizer in the streets of Chicago. I have found myself more and more attracted to Obama the more I read about his inclination, his instincts to be a very pragmatic politician.